Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mike Clegg. I'm the Dean of the school, for those of you who I haven't had the opportunity to meet. And as you know, this is a Dean's Lecture, and this is a tradition that we have here to recognize people who have been promoted to professor or appointed to professor in our school. And I say it at the beginning of every one, but you know, I tend to be a cynical person, I think, jaded, but to be promoted to professor here is really a great accomplishment. It's not easy, and to get the processes that you need, not only to be nominated by your chair and go through our A&P committee, but that people from around the world have to write in and say that you're worthy of being at this rank in one of the best, if not the best, universities in the world, certainly the best school of public health. And so it's something that we really celebrate. And today we're celebrating Kevin Frick, and he, I can tell you from reading his letters, and those of you who have seen his letters know what they said. You know, that Kevin is one of the world's leading health economists. He's an incredible collaborator, and he's applied his methodologic skills to a whole host of problems. So he had letters from various groups of people who have nothing to do with each other, with people who do nursing research, people who do work in ophthalmology and vision, all saying the same things quite independently. So I looked at Kevin's CV to introduce him, and I knew this, but I was sort of shocked that he got his PhD at the University of Michigan, because you know, people from the University of Michigan usually they are such chauvinists about the University of Michigan, and you know, and proud to be a Wolverine. And Kevin is the opposite of that. Kevin is such an accepting, kind, and gentle person. So he somehow overcame that, but he was a cougar or a panther before that, a Nittany lion. That's right. So that's right. So Kevin joined our school in 1996. He was hired by Al Sommer as the dean, and Don Steinwachs, who was chair of the department, and has established himself, as I said, an expert in health economics, but especially in cost-benefit analysis, and developed and the course here that now I think has about 150, 170 people taking it. He's been PI on a number of projects, but looks at the quality of care and chronic comorbidities for cancer, especially prostate, breast, and colorectal cancer survivors. And he was instrumental, as many of the people in this room were, in starting the interdepartmental health economics program. And when I became dean, we were in the process of trying to recruit a director for that. And after about a year, it became obvious that the best director that we could have was right here. So Kevin, as an associate professor, became the director of that. And under his stewardship, a kind and gentle stewardship, it grew. We were able to recruit a number of outstanding people to the school, and it continues to grow. So he's lectured here and around the university and around the world on a whole variety of things. Health services, research methods, policy, and he's especially loved by the School of Nursing. And I can remember at the advisory board where Martha Hill was there, and she spoke up so fervently on your behalf. But he's been, I saw everywhere he's given a guest lecture. I was a little worried by the number of universities you visited, and I hope that you'll stop doing that now. And then, but Kevin, we all know how deserving you are of this honor, and we're especially pleased to be celebrating it with you today, and happy to have you on the faculty. So, Kevin Frick.
All right, well, thank you very much. It's overwhelming to have all that said about you. So today I'm going to talk about future pedagogical approaches to health economics and economic evaluation. So these are two areas that I've taught in quite extensively, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about what's the best way to teach about these things, and that's what I want to share today. So I want to talk about why this topic, my passion for teaching, my vision for teaching, then sort of do a critical self-assessment. How does my own teaching stack up to what I say I want to be able to do? 6 common themes for I think about the future, and then conclude. So let's begin with why this topic. The dean commented on sort of what makes someone eligible for becoming a full professor here, and has a lot to do with research, teaching, and service. And a lot of people who get to that stage have a really clear and concentrated path to their research. That doesn't describe me. Each year as I was being mentored along through my assistant professor time here, the person who was the associate chair of the department at the time would always say to me, can you describe to me this year in fewer words than it took you last year what you're doing? Trying to get a real concentration of sort of the area that I was in. And I loved when Jerry asked me that, and I invariably just told him, no, I can't. And it didn't get any better when I was an associate professor. So my research career was never something that I could easily describe as something that easily could be summarized, or a very straightforward description. And I look back and I say, why was I involved in so many different areas for research? Well, one thing my advisor while I was in graduate school at the University of Michigan said to me as I was on my way practically out the door the last day I was there, you're interested in too many things. You need to focus. So she was saying the same thing that the associate chair was once I got here. And she was right. I like a lot of different areas. And when you get to an institution like this one, the opportunities just are abounding. I won't quite say endless, but they're quite plentiful. And I globbed onto a lot of different areas. I thought a lot of things were interesting. There's a constant need for funding. And I said, well, there's different areas that I could get funding in. But most importantly, I think one of the things that works between me and my colleagues is that I've learned to communicate with researchers in other fields about the intersection between what their specialty is and what my specialty is. And so communication is clearly a key element of teaching. Sometimes it's a formal setting in the classroom. Other times it's a not so formal setting. There's lots of teaching and learning that goes on when you have an interdisciplinary team sitting around the table trying to work together. And as I think back to some, the variety of projects that I've worked on, some of the most interesting ones were ones where my collaborators and I each had a genuine interest in learning about what the other did. And that works really well because that then facilitates the communication, facilitates the learning on both sides and the teaching in both directions, and really allows for an interesting interchange of ideas where you can then build upon both sets of ideas and make a better product at the end. So why do I want to talk about teaching? Again, my research agenda has been driven by my expertise being applied in many different areas. My ability to work with people in different areas has been facilitated by my ability to communicate with and teach others about my area of expertise. And I think back to one of the very first projects I was involved with in the School of Nursing, and the first time I tried to talk to my colleagues, I think I put up a calculus equation. That was not the best idea for talking to my colleagues in the School of Nursing. Very bright people, but that just wasn't where it was at for them. And so I've learned a lot from interacting with different groups. Teaching is an area in which I've had the opportunity to innovate. Some of my colleagues who have helped with my distance education online course are here, and they've seen how the course that I've worked on has evolved over time. And I'll talk about some of that innovation later on. Teaching has allowed me to connect with other people. It fits well with my Myers-Briggs personality type, which was part of the leadership program that I was involved with while I was here. And I really do find that I'm passionate about teaching. And just a little bit on the personality type. So introversion, so inner world. Intuition, more on the interpretation side than just sort of looking at what's there. Feeling, considering other people and circumstances, which I guess would reflect what Mike had commented on earlier. And then making a decision and moving on. And that's really a good set of characteristics for teaching. And when you read this set of characteristics, I didn't write this. Okay, this was something that was given to me by someone who works up at the Center for Teaching and Education. And a lot of what's up there in terms of commitment to the student, thinking about students on an individual basis, again, really does fit well with the way I view what I do as I teach and as I mentor students. So where does my passion for teaching come from? In research, we have an extended time to develop relationships and work on producing output when we're doing a study. In teaching, you get one chance per year. And with each group of students, you only generally get one chance to teach them what you want to teach them. And I really like to try to give my best effort to each cohort that I work with and get them to a level where they understand the material in a way that will remain accessible to them in the future. And maybe they'll take a permanent interest in the topic that I'm teaching. But the real key is this understandability factor, that I want them not to just be able to, tell me something on a test and not just to be able to talk about it on the day that we lecture about it, but to really understand it and take it with them when they're done in the courses that I teach. I've been asked to explain things to people for a very long time, and I've done a whole variety of different teaching activities, including, I think the most interesting thing on here, you can read down the list, but the most interesting thing is when I took my first epidemiology course as an undergrad, the instructor asked me to tutor somebody I was taking the course with. try to, that's an interesting thing, trying to tutor while you're taking the course. And then in graduate school, the expression, very common at least among economists and probably among most areas, is that the best way to learn something is in fact to have to teach it. And I've also spent some time learning about teaching and learning, both in investing in my own kids' education and learning about what they're doing, some reading on my own, and my department, to its credit, has invested in thinking about the quality of teaching that we are doing as a group. And we all got a copy of the book by Ken Bain, What the Best College Teachers Do. Did I always have a positive view? Now that's an interesting question because I enjoyed the experience of learning from most of my teachers. I was lucky enough to be exposed to a wonderful array of teachers from elementary school through graduate school. And so you might think that with the personality type and all this interest in teaching that I would have always had a very positive view. I did have a non-positive view at one point. My parents came for the presentation today, and it turns out that my mom was a teacher, and I once had the gall to ask her, why would anyone want to teach? This is while I was a teenager, and obviously at that time I wouldn't have anticipated that someday I'd be giving a lecture like this, talking about my vision for the future of teaching in a specific area, and so obviously my views have changed quite a bit since that time. So what's my vision for my own teaching? Okay, so the big question to start this off, and I like to always sort of tell people where I'm going, so what is in this picture? Okay, this is a picture of hard cider being brewed. You might wonder, why is that relevant to a lecture on the future of pedagogical processes in health economics? So we have multiple choice here. You could have recent evidence from reviews of my class suggest that sometimes students were so frustrated with this year's second-term classes that I thought they may have turned to hard cider afterwards. I've developed an approach to preparing for teaching and presenting material for which hard cider is the acronym. My reaction to students' views led me to turn to hard cider as a way of to leave the negativity behind, where my TAs and I were so happy with our perceived performance that we all went out for hard cider afterwards. While I might wish it was the last one, and I think we did a good job, it's actually the second of these four. And so I'm going to talk about what it is that hard cider stands for and why I think each of these elements is important for my teaching and how it might generalize. So what does hard cider stand for? Before teaching a class, I want to assess my class's heterogeneity. Okay, students are different, and I need to know about those differences and what that brings to their learning experiences before I try to talk to them. I need to know about their awareness of the prerequisites. We'll talk about that a bit. I need to know about their reality. Where are they coming from? What are they interested in? Why are they here in the School of Public Health taking an economics class or a cost-effectiveness class? And how does that fit with what they plan to do with the material that I'm trying to teach them? And then I have to give them directions before I start teaching them. And then when I teach economic concepts or I teach about cost-effectiveness, I strive to contextualize the problem so that in many ways relates back to the reality issue, present the main idea, demonstrate a solution using the techniques and the ideas that I've given them, give the students an exercise, so allow them to practice without being graded the first time and try to get them to fear the problem a little bit less when they go at it, and then allow students to reflect on what they've done. And only then, once I've done all of that in preparation for teaching and in trying to teach them, only then should I try to assess the students' learning. So again, we have heterogeneity, awareness, reality, and directions, and then contextualize, idea, demonstrate, exercise, and reflect. I've had many different teaching experiences in many different settings. I'm not going anywhere, but I do like going other places to give lectures because it's fun usually to go to the other universities. But as I thought about my future teaching and what I've done, I pondered, the health economics courses we were teaching when I first arrived and how where we are now has evolved from that point and how different it is, thanks to many of my health economics colleagues who are here with me this afternoon. The way in which my contribution to the teaching of health economics has evolved, and then the evolution of our whole curriculum. And I kept coming back to these concepts from the hard cider acronym. You might also ask, since I mentioned health economics and not just teaching in general in the title of this lecture, is economics special? So lots of fields in public health use lots of numbers. Lots of fields in public health use lots of graphs. And many fields try to explain interrelationships among things. Economics brings all three of these together. So it's not just trying to figure out a statistical relationship, but is using a theory to explain why you'd get that statistical relationship and how you might even detect that statistical relationship. And the theory is internally consistent, and cost effectiveness brings together information from a whole bunch of different areas in the school. And students often have very preconceived notions about what economics and cost effectiveness are. And sometimes I have to overcome those notions and tell them, well, that's not really what we're going to be learning about. So in some ways, there are some special aspects of economics that make it different, that make it a little bit more challenging maybe to think about what students' awareness is and what their reality is relative to economics. But in some ways, these are principles that are very generalizable, I would hope. So preparing myself and the students for learning. Heterogeneity. Not all students learn the same way. Okay? There's been lots of work on this in the past couple of decades. You have this work on multiple intelligences, there's different capacities that we can tap into, and the goal of understanding and being able to use the concepts when we're done. And different personality types. Again, coming back to the Myers-Briggs, I'll show a couple of examples. And then learning styles may be correlated with gender, age, or types of positions people have. So if I think about how I work with an MPH group of students versus a group of health economics PhD students or other PhD students versus a group of Doctor of Nursing practice students, three very different audiences with very different goals and very different ideas about what goes into the learning process sometimes. So this is just a couple of examples, again, from my colleagues in the Center for Training and Education. You have a traditionalist who relates well to the traditional classroom setting, best at studying facts and procedures, versus, again, the so-called catalyst based on a couple of the Myers-Briggs criteria, where this person thrives on recognition and loves group work and dialogue rather than just studying things. So again, students who would have these different types of personalities might need much different learning opportunities in order to get the best experience out of a class that I'm trying to teach. Incidentally, of course, there's also heterogeneity among instructors. So what works for me may not work for my health economics colleagues, and that's an important thing to recognize as well. And again, I think it's more about the particulars and whether the particulars would work across different personality types, while the principles in general are probably fairly transferable. So this is just a little bit longer explanation of what my personality type fits with. I think, again, it comes down to the concern, thinking about possibilities, and thinking about interesting ways of making presentations that really captures how I think my personality relates to the teaching that I do. And you can contrast that with the traditionalist on the teaching side as well as on the learning side, where somebody might focus mostly on the basics and fundamentals and the usefulness of information rather than interpretation and trying to figure out how to build on it and improvise on information. So what about awareness? Obviously, many courses have prerequisites. Everyone's supposed to have taken the prerequisite before you take the next class, but taking the prerequisite and mastering the information at a level that you can understand it and use it again in the future are often two very different things. They shouldn't be, but many times they are. It's also the case that students who come to an economics or cost effectiveness class have other background learning experiences and bring other assumptions to the table. So knowing something about the background and assumptions the students have helps me. So a recent example of this importance of awareness, I helped to run a course in the DNP program in the School of Nursing here. Students generally are returning after either sometimes a very long portion of their career, sometimes after just a relatively small number of years. But when I asked the students at the start of this class, what do you think of economics? They all say, well, it's full of numbers, it's very technical, full of jargon, and not just a way of thinking about why people behave the way they do, which is really in many ways what economics is about. So I have them read this book called The Economic Naturalist, where somebody collected essays that had been written by basically his night school students in a college setting, and basically said, no matter how much you might think graphs and equations are important, ultimately the question is, can we just use the logic and reason about it? And when they read this, they often will come back and say, I didn't realize economics could be such a creative field. I didn't realize economics could be applied to so many different things. And I didn't realize that it could be something where it's mostly just about reasoning. And that really changes their opinion, and it changes their readiness then to engage in a discussion about economics because they're no longer fearing that it's just going to be a bunch of numbers that they're having trouble working with. I can really think that there was a single aha moment on this issue of awareness, which really got me started thinking about teaching as an area for improvement and an area for study on my own, rather than just something that I did as part of my job from one year to the next. And it was here on campus. There was a local Sigma Theta Tau conference. Sigma Theta Tau is the honor society for nursing. And in this particular conference, there were back-to-back plenary speakers. The speaker before me gave this presentation that I suddenly sort of jotted down some notes and said, I can link what I'm talking about directly to this. Many times when I'm talking to an audience about things that they're not familiar with, I'll get sort of the glazed over look, well, you're talking about economics and you're talking about cost effectiveness and these are really hard concepts and I'm just trying to hang on. But when I was able to take what I had to say about cost effectiveness and the importance of cost effectiveness as a research area and link it directly to what the nurse researcher before me had presented, the proverbial light bulbs that were going on over people's heads in the rooms, it was just great because people were obviously getting what I was saying in a much different way than many of the presentations that I had made before. And that really sort of emphasized to me, and it was really the root of my understanding of the importance of awareness as what I like to call a necessary but certainly not sufficient condition for me to achieve a high quality of teaching. And it really changed my view that I try to assess my audiences beforehand, and then I try to build a bridge between what I believe the students know already and what I think that they should know as a result of the class or the lecture that I'm giving. And that thought process about building a bridge and trying to bridge that gap and bring students over to the other side of that bridge is really helpful for me, and I would hope it will be helpful for others, in terms of thinking about how to convey sometimes complicated topics to students who are seeing it for the first time. The reality. I always think to myself, in what setting will the students need to use the information that I plan to teach them? And in a school like this, particularly teaching the wide variety of students, there's in our health economics class, we had between 90 and 100, and in our online cost effectiveness class, we had 170 students enrolled this past term. So there's difference between the U.S. healthcare system and international healthcare systems. As policy changes in the United States, even the United States healthcare system changes over time. And then students in their professional lives, either before what I'm teaching them or after what I'm teaching them, or both, have a wide variety of roles in the healthcare system. And so their needs for and their potential uses of the information vary quite a bit, and I need to recognize that. So why is this so important? Students in professional programs tend to view the world through an applied lens. They rightfully want to know how what I am teaching them can be directly applied to what they are already doing or what they're going to be doing in their job in public health and medical care. So as I think about planning a course, I have to think about how I'm going to relate what I'm teaching to what's of interest to these students, and to be prepared to answer questions on these relationships as we go through. So a great example in the health economics course that I taught in the fall, I was able to share with students a description of a health system's response to a shortage of pharmaceutical products for the management of pain in patients in a hospital. And I said, you're going to write a hypothetical letter to the editor, and you get to choose which perspective you're taking. Okay, I'm not going to tell you you have to write it from the physician's perspective or the hospital administration's perspective. You choose which perspective is most relevant to you. And then students could also choose particular points on which to focus. Health behaviors, the care provided, the cost, the quality. And that gave students the ability not just to say, okay, I'm going to analyze the situation from an economist's point of view, but I'm going to analyze the situation using the tools that I've learned, using the economic logic that I've picked up, using this thought process that I've been learning about, but I'm going to have the opportunity to think which one of these roles that I gave them the opportunity to think about, which of these roles is most important or most relevant to the way I need to think about things in the future, and then address points that were of the most interest to them. So really allowing for that variation in students' realities is quite important. Directions. Students want to know what's expected. That's not limited to students, certainly. So I like to review the syllabus with a specific focus on what's expected, not only in terms of the readings and the assignments, but also their participation and how that will affect their grade. And then I encourage them about how to use the practice examples that I give them, because that's not something that they're always having the opportunity to do. I encourage them to question and discuss the premises of economics and the premises of cost effectiveness and the applications that we're putting it to. And I encourage them to use opportunities for group learning appropriately to understand the material. So certainly, even in class, they can work in small groups as long as their final work is their own. Then once we get to the teaching and learning process, providing context, this of course is related to the preparation point of being aware of students' realities and how they expect to use what's being taught once they get into their careers. Providing context during the course means focusing on how someone actually can, or better yet, actually is using the information that's being taught. So as an example of context, in my course called Understanding Cost Effectiveness, and this is the online one with 170 students in it, students learn how to assess the quality of a cost effectiveness article. Now, they need to be convinced this is a worthy goal, because a lot of students want to do cost effectiveness and not just learn about the quality of cost effectiveness articles. We have other courses which my colleagues teach on how to do the cost effectiveness studies. But I tell students there's going to be a point in your career when maybe you're going to be asked, maybe you're a clinical specialist, but you're still going to be given an article on cost effectiveness to review for a journal. And so you're going to need to know about this. Or maybe you're going to be reviewing grant proposals for our National Institutes of Health or other funders, and you're going to need to know what makes something a quality cost effectiveness study versus one that's of lower quality. Or maybe even just in your career, you'll be looking at published papers related to policy change and having to think, which one of these studies should I take the word of if they're giving me different conclusions, and how do I judge which study is the better study? Next, we present the main idea. Economics and cost effectiveness are both things where you have sort of 30,000-foot views of the world, but you also have microscopic views of the world with lots of details, lots of nuances, and some possible reinterpretations. The key to teaching economics, and really probably anything conceptual, is to limit the number of concepts and teach them deeply, rather than teaching a broad range of concepts only at a cursory surface level. Now, I've been learning this over time, and I've really tried to sort of cut back and teach a few concepts and work them all the way through, as opposed to covering everything that goes along with chapters in a textbook, as an example. Then, if and when students are ready, then you can talk to them about the nuances. Then you can talk to them about the details. But the first key is to cover the main points well. Demonstrate how to solve the problem. One thing that I've noticed in my teaching is that when you have a very conceptual area that's full of a combination of logic, graphs, and mathematics, the first time you walk a student through, it's the instructor's role to really play an active role in walking students through the entire process from start to finish. As someone who's been at this for a couple decades now, I can do those steps myself. I have to remember that when students are seeing this for the first time, they need help. And they need to be advised on how to say, here's where we begin the problem, here's how we think about the problem, here's what we first put down on paper to get ourselves going, and then here's the other steps that we need to take, and make those linkages explicit for them so they can see it done once before they go and try to do it on their own. So, example of a demonstration, there's a new course that we're offering for the first time as we speak called Exercises in Cost Effectiveness. This is an online course as well as the Understanding Cost Effectiveness. The entire course in this case is structured around lectures on how to perform specific calculations that lead to a cost effectiveness result that you can then interpret and write about. And we're going to have another little session after the end of this course. There's a follow-up to it, where students will actually then see how it all gets put together. But this class is really just about demonstrating, here's how you do this calculation, and then following up with an exercise, which is the next thing that I'll talk about, on each of those that the students get to work through themselves. So having seen a demonstration of how to solve a problem, students should be given an opportunity to practice before they are tested. This adds to the instructor's work, certainly, as it requires developing essentially 2 problem sets for similar material, but providing students with a no-strings-attached, skills-building opportunity can greatly enhance the learning process for students. This approach is also limited by students' general time crunch, but if you build into the directions that you give them that this is an expectation, you're going to benefit from this, then they're much more likely to take it up and much more likely to view it as a positive experience rather than just another thing on their to-do list. So an example of this exercise in exercises in cost effectiveness, I've posted a series of practice workbooks. So when you're working in Excel, you have different ways you can work out formulas. And a lot of times if I'm working in Excel on a particular cost effectiveness analysis, I would do most of it on one sheet. But what I've done is said, well, here's the first sheet. Here's how you start the problem. Now you try to take the next step. And they have space where they can work on it. And hopefully, they'll try to work on it themselves before they then flip over to the next worksheet and say, well, here's how I did it. And the students can then compare. How did they do it? How did I do it? And each step along the way, we show them the formulas. We show them how to do it. We show all kinds of comments about the choices that were made in terms of how to do it. And again, I'll let you know 8 weeks from now whether or not this worked well for the students. But certainly having that opportunity to hear a lecture and then see a workbook where they can work through it on their own time at their own pace before having to do the assignment should make it a much better learning experience. Also, in the existing online class, Understanding Cost Effectiveness, students can access evaluations of articles that they're not assigned to do as their assignments. So there's 3 articles that they have to do an evaluation of the quality of the articles for their assignments, but there's 3 other articles that my TAs write evaluations of, and the students are invited to read the extra articles, try to write a basic answer themselves, and then consult the TA's response, and again, make this comparison between what they have done in their first attempt in an exercise level, again, without any grade and no strings attached, and compare it with the way that the TAs had answered it. And then finally, for reflection, students hopefully will take the time to review and reflect on how their answers differ from the suggested answers, if they do, and then ask questions as appropriate. Now, in an online setting, this is really straightforward because the bulletin boards in the classes that I teach can be accessed asynchronously, so students can go on whenever they want to, and sometimes other students are going to answer their questions because other students have better insight for whatever reason, or my TAs and I will comment within a day or two so that the student can say, well, I didn't understand why you put this as the expected answer. I put something else. Can you explain this, or can you reinterpret this for me? And it's a great forum in which to see, and then you have a running list of all the questions that were posed by students and all the answers that were given. And then finally, the assessment. So in the course Understanding Cost Effectiveness, it's always about writing a quality assessment in terms of taking an article and commenting on its quality. In Exercises in Cost Effectiveness, again, this new online course, it's always about how to use a tool like Microsoft Excel to solve problems. In health economics, it's not nearly as straightforward. We don't use just a single assessment method in health economics. There's a wide variety of assessment methods. We have students do problem sets. We have them do some problems that are mostly replication of what they've already learned. We have students do things where they've got to extend to something they haven't seen before. And we have writing assignments as well, as I had mentioned earlier. And in the Doctor of Nursing practice class, it's all about using economic logic to reason through health policy and healthcare delivery applications when it comes to health economics. So next I ask, how does my own teaching stack up against these criteria that I've set out? And I call it a tale of 2 ongoing courses. So you have the health economics class. It's an in-class course. And I still teach this in a way that I can't refer to as anything other than good old-fashioned lecturing. Yes, we have PowerPoint these days. Yes, I'm lecturing on current material, but I could have been doing the same type of lecturing 20 or 30 years ago. And it's interesting that I find myself so constrained, and I haven't been able to break that habit despite all of what I consider some very interesting things that I've done that I'll tell you about in the online class. Economists have written quite a bit about this, and there's actually, they've come up with a term for it called chalk and talk. So your stereotypical economics or math type of class where historically a professor would have been writing on the chalkboard and drawing graphs or writing equations and just go plowing through. Now, at the very least, I've tried to make my class, even with 60 or 80 people sitting in an auditorium, a little more seminar-like. Some students, based on the reviews that I received, actually find this unappealing. In my opinion, I think students are going to learn better when they ask questions based on their current understanding and then receive feedback on whether or not they have the right understanding and how they can build on it rather than just being lectured at. But obviously that doesn't appeal to everybody. And certainly avoid just teaching to the book. You know, textbooks have been written a couple years ago. They cover things in a certain way. It may or may not be the best way for our public health students. I always try to add in some public health economics in addition to what we mostly find as medical care economics in most textbooks. And so I'm always trying to add something and bring in current policy and public health issues wherever possible. So how do we give the students the opportunity for practice exercises and then eventual assessment? We made practice problem sets for the first time this year. Students had the opportunity to ask questions on the bulletin board. We do actually have a bulletin board for in-class courses, and I tried to use it for the first time last academic year, got used maybe twice the entire 8-week term. This academic year it was used more often, still not used as much as the bulletin board in the online class, but we're working toward that. Also working toward covering a smaller number of concepts, but in much more detail, and following this proposal that I have for walking students all the way through during the demonstration process and making the links for them the first time they see it. And I really need to find the right mix of students learning on their own through reading, my lecturing, and working through problems. And it's a work in progress still. The key is to get the students to make the links, to take an idea that they've learned, conceptualize how to put it in a graph or mathematical expression, and work with it to get an answer that they can then interpret. And just as the case with cost effectiveness, the key is always to provide context for students. I do sometimes mix in some humorous current events things. Back in the 2008 election, I talked about the demand for eyeglasses, particularly Sarah Palin-style eyeglasses, and the students at least found that moderately humorous at the time. So the future of in-class teaching for me, I hope to have less chalk and talk, or maybe reveal with a spiel is not the best way to phrase it for PowerPoint, but I'm not quite sure what the PowerPoint equivalent of chalk and talk would be. There actually are 2 books that my fellow economists have written about alternatives to chalk and talk, and really thinking about ways that you can get at these economic concepts other than just drawing things up on the board. One of the texts actually suggests a process that they called think, pair, square, share, which is essentially a method of getting the student to think about an idea on their own a little bit first, and then share it with increasingly larger groups before they share it with the class, so they get comfortable with sharing their idea. Now, in the interest of time, if I ever actually try this, I'll probably skip the pair and just go from thinking to small groups to the large group. But nevertheless, it could be a way for students who are interested and think they have an idea to share, but don't necessarily want to phrase it in front of the entire class first, to become comfortable with their idea in advance of bringing it to the entire class to think about. So understanding cost effectiveness, this other course that I've been teaching now for 8 years, it was first taught in a summer institute setting, which is 2 full days, start to finish, 9 to 5. That's not the best way to learn, in my opinion. And it became one of the first attempts that the school made to put an economic evaluation or economics course online. And it's had 3 major iterations in the years that I've been teaching it. At first, it was largely oriented toward a basic approach to methods rather than as full of an approach that we would give in the in-class setting. Then it evolved to be evaluating the quality of published articles, so that was the next step in the evolutionary process, using criteria that had been developed in the United States back in 1996. So for years, I had been using these old criteria. When it came time to revise it again for the current academic year, I said, you know, those criteria are now almost a decade and a half old. There's been many international criteria that have been developed since then, so we're going to pick new criteria. And that was the main innovation this past year, new criteria and a new way of trying to fit the ideas together. So what are the elements of online learning? We have an active bulletin board. And of all the things that you can do with the bulletin board, obviously students can get their questions answered and think about how it applies to policy and all those sorts of things which you would expect. But it's also key in terms of the criteria that I gave or the steps that I gave in the hard cider acronym, that if you have students do a brief introduction, and I was encouraged to have students do a brief introduction the very first time I taught this class, and I've done it every year since then, and I've begun to see it in new ways, particularly since I try to either have myself or my TAs to respond and actually welcome the students after their introduction to make them feel like they're not just throwing it out into space and it never gets looked at. But you get to know about the students' awareness a bit because they'll tell you what they've been doing with cost effectiveness if they've done anything before. And you get to know about their realities. Because I ask students, tell me where you are right now. Are you a full-time student who just happens to be taking an online course? Or are you out there in the workforce someplace where cost effectiveness is relevant to you day in and day out and you just need to know more information? So I use this as a way to fulfill some of the aspects of the hard cider approach that I've talked about. Self-assessment quizzes, one form of an exercise, and obviously can help the students to make sure that they're getting it. And I really just give them as self-assessment quizzes. I expect the students to take them, but it's up to them to then use it as a learning experience to see whether or not they understand what they've been learning. We have wiki pages in our homegrown system that the school uses, and those are used for small group assignments where they can do essentially both the exercise and the reflection step when it comes to one of the criteria, which is really nice. I attempted inserting music within the lectures to serve as a time for students to take a breath and think. It got a mixed reception. This was the first year we tried that. But it does suggest ways that you can be creative with your teaching in addition to just giving a lecture that's pre-recorded. And
Was you playing the guitar?
it wasn't me playing the guitar, but it was music that either I or my now 14-year-old had composed. So, and then class emails and news flashes can allow for directions to be reiterated and refined over time. The key to the online learning process, we teach about the background of cost effectiveness and the criteria for judging the quality of the article. We focus on a few points about how such studies are done so that when students are reading the published articles, they know what they're seeing in the article. Identify other types of economic evaluation just so they know it's not just cost effectiveness. And then we talk a bit about how it's used in policy. The students' opportunities for learning, they learn about the concept. They work on evaluating the concept in a group. Okay, so each student is assigned to a group that evaluates one criteria as a group, and they help each other understand. And then after the group has worked on it, their work is made available to the other students, and the group does a little presentation during one of our 3 live settings during the 8-week term. So we're mostly reading things at different times. We do have 3 live settings. And then students in the group and the rest of the class have the opportunity to comment on what was been said or question what's been said on the bulletin board afterwards. And then all students have the opportunity to look at the example assignment, and then they hand in their graded assignment and they're given feedback. So it's a nice series of steps, each one building on the next, from one idea to a set of ideas to the class and then doing their assignments. Live talks that I run are a fairly active experience, as any of my TAs who have helped me with this or any of the students who have taken it can attest to. I try to take advantage of nearly every opportunity provided in the online setting, which makes it a bit busy. And I have gotten that comment from some students, and even I sometimes think, how are we going to manage all this? But we have students submit their questions in advance of the live session. We have groups of students work on these wiki pages in advance of the live session. Then students choose a presenter in advance. I have an agenda. I tried running live talks without an agenda one year. That didn't work very well because it was just a very scattered discussion for the hour or hour and a half that you have. And then have student presentations become the dominant element of the experience during the live session, which gives other students a chance to say, oh, well, people really can get this. And it gives a way to then have something to comment on. Multiple interactive approaches. While students are presenting, other students, as well as faculty, can comment in a little chat box in our live talk setting. And that works pretty well. One student said, well, they could hear the faculty member typing, and they thought I should be listening to the student presenting rather than typing. But, we all multitask. And I thought that the comment that I made was a useful comment. While students present, I listen and then present an analysis of the student's interpretation afterwards so that the whole class gets to hear whether it was a good interpretation or whether there were things that could be improved. During the live talk, we have polls so that we're asking students questions during the live talk as well. Sometimes I'll ask students to elaborate on why they responded to a poll in a certain way on the chat board, and then we'll interpret the poll in discussion afterwards. And at the end of each live talk, there's a time for general Q&A to answer some of those pre-presented questions that came from the bulletin board. As you can see, trying to imagine all that going on at once, it's a lot, and sometimes the students do have to go back and review certain parts of it. So again, these are clearly busy experiences. The students do find it intellectually invigorating. I mean, ever since I've been doing this, and I do owe it to The very first time we had polls, my TA Lynn, who was out there, helped me with this, and it was a great experience. The live talk got wonderful reviews. So we've just continued with this process, and some of the students say, you know, there's a lot going on, but they all say how it's an experience that works for them. And we've tweaked this over time, working with my teaching assistants, to reach a point where we receive some very positive feedback each time. Latest feedback from the students, one student, now this is out of 100 evaluations, so I'm not going to make big changes to the course based on 1 out of 100 evaluations, said they felt like when they were doing these quality evaluations, it was a rote response. Certainly that wasn't the intention, because what I want the students to do is think about the quality criteria and not just say, did it meet it or not, and pull a few lines from the article and put it in quotes, but I want them to think, how could it be better, and how does it relate to decisions that I might want to make based on this article? So obviously I wasn't doing a good enough job at context for at least this one student, and it just reminds me that I have to think about, well, how are students going to interpret this, and how am I going to demonstrate to them that it's really worthwhile? So when I teach, I do what I think of as a continuous quality improvement effort. We develop an effort or a course for a given year, and this year, for the first time, I made an active point to actually have at least one, if not more than one, meeting with my groups of TAs for my 2 courses in the fall before the class started, and that was helpful. I got lots of good feedback from the TAs. Implement that effort, take feedback as I go along, and the nice thing about the courses in this school is that there are ways that students can provide anonymous feedback as they go along, so that if there's something that's really bothering them that I have the power to improve in a given 8 weeks, we can do that. So a great example is a feedback after each live talk in the online class, and it's not got a terribly high response rate, but there have been a number of times when the first live talk went a certain way, I got some very distinct feedback from students, and I at least made small modifications to the other 2 live talks during the course that made them much better experiences for the students. And then reflect on that effort. When all is said and done, I discuss it with the TAs, I get back the evaluations, I discuss those with the TAs, I'll sometimes bring it to other instructors like my other health economics colleagues, and for the online courses I'll bring it to the instructional design team and say, why didn't this work, or do you have any ideas, and what have other faculty tried, and then of course revise the effort and try it again a year later. So if you want to put this whole approach together, you start off with developing or afterwards redeveloping an effort, and then you implement it. And the steps to implementing, and I've sort of the yellow are the things that require some thought or some pause. The green are the things that just sort of go. Obviously, the assessment of the student's understanding is in black, and then that reflection afterwards is in red. But it's a straightforward process where you develop, you implement. At the start of the implementation, you assess things like the heterogeneity, awareness, and realities for the students. Provide them with directions. Then do those other 5 steps, the cider steps, the context, ideas, demonstration, exercises, and reflection. Students have opportunities to give feedback in class settings. They can send anonymous emails, which again is a nice thing to have to know whether you're completely missing something that students need or just need to reorganize a bit. Then you assess the student's understanding, and the feedback can be about those assessments, or the feedback can be about other elements of the learning process. The course ends after you've assessed the student's understanding. You then reflect on that effort, and you go back and start the whole process over again. I've also looked at the book Understanding by Design. It really emphasized a lot of things that when I talked to a dear old friend of mine who's now in curriculum development in a public school system back in Pennsylvania, he said it's all the things we would have thought if we really thought about it, but putting it down on paper formally. So planning the objective first, rather than picking a textbook first, and then thinking about how to meet that objective using the most relevant materials available, rather than just working your way through a textbook. And again, out of this idea comes teaching a smaller number of topics in a deeper way, rather than a large number of topics in a cursory way, and ultimately the goal being to prepare the students to learn more later on their own by building on what they've learned completely, rather than teaching them just enough to get by and then probably not retain it as well. So I have 6 common themes for my own future. Common theme number 1, reasoning in economics should involve writing as well as solving mathematical problems. A lot of people who have had undergraduate economics classes probably think I'm mostly going to be doing these problems where there's these equations I have to work out and I've got to do graphs. Well, I think there's writing elements that are also just as important. These turn out to be a challenge for me to grade, a challenge for my teaching assistants to grade, but they demonstrate whether the students actually get the logic. and not just whether they can do the mathematical problems. And the key here is to figure out the best way to phrase questions that are understandable to students. We've struggled with that sometimes, that don't have obvious answers, and that really allow students to interpret it in multiple ways so that, again, they can bring the economics back to their own reality. I've given an example of the writing assignment. This is just a little reiteration. Again, thinking about how to take the economic concepts and write about them. And I told them they only had, I forget whether we limited them to 250 or 350 words, but that really forced them to think through things in a very detailed way and to get the ideas down as efficiently as possible as well. And students complain, but I always tell them, once you're out in a job, people are going to read a page for the most part. And so you need to be able to think about how to communicate your ideas as efficiently as possible. Common theme number 2, I want the students to question economics. Okay, I don't teach economics as dogma. I don't teach it as this is the way the world has to work. I teach it as one potential explanation of human behavior and organizational behavior, and not necessarily the only explanation of that behavior. Sometimes we question assumptions. Sometimes we question conclusions. And I want students to be as critical of the science as they are proficient with the science when they're done, and understand the good points and the weak points in economics. So there are multiple ways you might put this questioning in context. There's a book called Predictable Irrationality. It looks at many ways in which human behavior doesn't seem to match what economics, if we predicated it only on valuing goods and services, would predict. The author questions the existence of utility. I take it a slightly different approach. I say, well, maybe there's just things in the utility function that go beyond money and goods and services. People care about status. How do we quantify that and put it in a utility function? That's a separate question. But people care about things like status and friendship and other things that are difficult to quantify but clearly interact with their perceptions of goods and services. So, we talk about things that people are going to care about. When we talk about physician decision-making in health economics, we ask, well, what does a physician care about besides how much money he or she makes? And get the students thinking about issues like that. So it makes economics more expansive and more inclusive rather than strict and narrow. And as you can tell, not only is that a theme of my teaching, but it's a theme for my entire career. So an example of questioning economics, another new online course that's going up right now, is Obesity Economics. The final assignment takes a review of a book by a former FDA commissioner. And this FDA commissioner commented on how little control we might actually have over our choices of what to eat because of a variety of food science things that he suggests really send signals to the brain about different things that are going to influence our taste and our ability to discern when we're full. And I ask students to say, if you believe what's written here, compare it and contrast it with what economics says about reasoning, about choices that we make related to our obesity. And so again, it's a way of showing, do they understand the economics, and do they understand how to question the economics all at once? Common theme number 3, learning about economics should involve discussion. In the online format, we have the opportunity to do this through all of the live talk wiki pages and bulletin boards. And in the classroom format, despite the number of students that are in the classroom, I really do try to make it a seminar-like discussion. And the key is that there's 2 challenges. One is it gets students to think on the fly. A second is I'm not always prepared to answer the exact question the students have posed, so I sometimes have to sort of rephrase the question in a way that is answerable. Not that I'm trying to be like a politician there, but you just have to try to use the classroom time as efficiently as possible. And then one thing, obviously, if you're allowing for a lot of discussion, you have to avoid digressions that go too far. Common theme number 4, give the students an idea of the need for the reasoning and the economic logic that I'm providing. And I sort of like to call this context plus. So you start by providing a context for everything. And again, that's really important in our applied setting here. Don't just assume that students are interested because they are there. Many of the students who are there are required to take the course and probably wouldn't take it if they weren't required to. And so you need to tell them, where is this going? And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll say, here's the answer that we're working towards. Now here's how we get there. So rather than sort of going through step by step by step, oh, here's the final answer, really take the approach of telling them, here's where we're going, now let's follow a path on the way to get there and understand that path. Common theme number 5, make it clear that economically motivated decision making is a part of our everyday lives. So sometimes I use personal examples of decisions that are dictated by economics. With 3 kids, I have lots of opportunity to talk about healthcare interaction decisions. There are stories in the news in which people are responding to economics incentives. We can bring those in. I do a little bit of blogging about health economics, and so people can read the examples that I've written up there. And you can also use examples from popular culture. So there's actually a book on economics in literature. I have to say, even for my own profession, I didn't think that many of my colleagues had thought about this all that much. When I started looking at what books were out there, alternatives to Chalk and Talk I had mentioned earlier, a book on economics in literature that somebody had actually written, it's amazing to see what people have already thought about in terms of possible changes in the way that we teach economics. And I also sometimes refer students to an example of human capital loss or loss productivity measurement, which has all kinds of applications in cost benefit and cost effectiveness, that's found in the Old Testament. Everybody always asks, where did you find this? So I wouldn't show this otherwise because it's not that important, but it's an interesting thing from Exodus where straight out of the Old Testament it says, when men quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, not mortally but enough to put him in bed, the one who struck the blow shall be acquitted, provided the other can get up and still walk around. Still, he must compensate him for his enforced idleness and provide for his complete cure. Okay? So this is about economics and conflict. And this is something that just reflects the fact that our economics and our decision-making and our thought processes all fit together in ways that relate to our day-to-day real lives. Finally, I want to make sure that I make the course a positive learning experience for my teaching assistant as well as for the students. There are multiple opportunities for the teaching assistant to be involved and to be incorporated into the learning process. As I mentioned earlier, one common thing is there's no better way to learn something than to teach it. And involving the teaching assistants, they can be involved in the development of the course at the syllabus or readings level. They are certainly involved in providing feedback to the students about their assessments. They're involved in sometimes answering student questions and interacting on the bulletin board. And they really can be involved in just pointing out what are the pros and cons and strengths and weaknesses of the teaching that I'm doing. So where does this leave me? I want to emphasize that I've done a lot of teaching, as you can see, but I certainly haven't taught or managed the entire economics curriculum single-handedly here. What I'm teaching now, in terms of the understanding cost effectiveness in that first health economics course, does serve as a gateway, or in some cases complementary work, particularly with the exercises in cost effectiveness, to what my colleagues are teaching. And while I've been here, I was mentioned that I was hired back in '96, we had about 17 credits of economics coursework, depending on how you count things, at that time. Now, we have over 40 credits of economics coursework with a much larger number of faculty members who are contributing to that coursework. And we haven't gotten to the point where we've sat down and said, here's every syllabus, and here's every learning objective, and how do they all fit together? But we have gotten to the point where we are much better at talking to each other. Here's my course that precedes your course. How can yours build on mine? What can I do to help students get ready for yours? And to make it fit together as part of a whole so that students who are taking a sequence of economics courses here have the best experience possible. And it really comes back to why do we have a need for this much economics? In addition to the fact that we hired faculty who need to teach something when they're here, why have we gone from 17 credits to more than 40 credits? That's more than 2.5 times as many credits. Well, it's a real motivation for resource allocation. Again, not the only one, but an important one. It's a way that we can explore the motivation for private and public health decisions that are made by individuals or society as a whole. It really complements other views of causality and motivation, and students can then compare and contrast. And it's a tool that explicitly recognizes and is largely based on studying limits that characterize our medical care and public health systems, not only in the United States, but around the world. And so to have a set of tools that talks about limits and talks about behaviors is a nice set of tools to bring to a public health audience in a school like ours. Striving to reach multiple audiences, each audience requires at least a little bit of investment to use the hard cider approach. Okay? Because I've got to think about their heterogeneity. I've got to think about their awareness. And different audiences, again, come to the table with different backgrounds. And it does take time to understand that. It's a challenge, but if I'm going to find the experience fulfilling as an instructor, in the same way that I hope the students are going to find the experience fulfilling on the student side of things, then I really do have to make at least a little bit of investment because it makes it so much more of a worthwhile experience. What about the generalizability? Again, I think that the particulars of what works as a teaching method for me with one audience will not necessarily work for my colleagues, and maybe not even for all possible audiences that I teach. But the underlying principles, this notion of gathering information about who you're teaching, giving them clear directions, and then giving them a context with a proper demonstration of the use of the concepts and the opportunity to employ the concepts before they are assessed formally, I think applies in general. And certainly within the teaching that I do, maximizes the probability of a positive educational experience. I've also learned that I'm never going to please all the students all the time, particularly when we have students with such a heterogeneity of backgrounds coming into the health economics courses that I teach. But at the end of the day, pleasing them is not necessarily the goal. The goal is to make sure that we have a variety of learning opportunities available so that later in their careers, when students need the concepts, they will be able to use them because one of the different learning opportunities worked well for them. So in conclusion, my future pedagogical approaches are what I believe will help me to achieve the goals that I have in terms of the students' understanding with the students that I teach. I think that my description of my background and my vision, it's meant to be descriptive rather than prescriptive because, again, different things will work in different ways for different people. And while I always hope for positive feedback about my courses, sometimes it's the negative feedback that actually leads to the greatest changes in how I have taught, what I have taught, and the ideas that I have tried to share with students over time. So with that, I thank you and open for questions.
So Kevin, was that really cider? Because that was really red.
Maybe it's just the projector.
So it's funny, I have an acronym for how I act as dean, and I never shared with anybody. It's Chardonnay. Okay, so I think, I can't remember a dean's lecture that focused on education before, and so it was really great to
thank you.
see it. And, yeah, well, I learned a new acronym. But I also, you know, it's very interesting to see people who work at, I mean, in public health, it's all about crossing disciplines, right? You know, whether it's medicine and population-based, or but to work at the you know, the interface between economics and populations, and I have to say, even though we've spoken a lot about what you do, I didn't realize how deep into your brain this viewpoint goes. It really, I mean, you look at the world in a fundamentally different way than I look at the world, and as an economist. So.
I think that's, most economists in the room would agree with that statement, probably.
So, okay,
sure.
So questions? Okay, David.
Okay. Yeah.
You want to call? You can go.
I have a big voice. Well, we can project it too. I think a lot of us who teach, Kevin, are sitting here thinking, wow. I know from teaching online, I do it completely different than when I do it in the classroom. Mm-hmm. And, you know, a number of us, at least in my department, have been saying they find online sort of liberating because they can try different things. Yet when we get into the classroom, it's the old chalk and talk. Right. And, you know, it's really hard to think of alternatives of how do you deal with, in our case, 275 students in the, you know, you can't pose questions. We try, and, you know, the usual group in the front
right.
who will talk, but most of them are on Facebook anyway. I don't know. I think it would be interesting to lead a discussion of the faculty, you know, to really talk about how do we improve what we do in the classroom, in this kind of a classroom.
I think, you know, in terms of, I mean, I haven't dealt with 270. I've dealt with 100 in the economics.
Over 75 is the same.
Well, I think with 100, maybe 80 of whom show up on any given day. You know, there is that opportunity still to engage in a bit of a discussion. And you're right that there's probably, you know, I could probably count a dozen students out of those 80 who are asking 80% of the questions. But nevertheless, you'll occasionally get that extra question from somebody else, and you'll see, well, this person really does understand, even though they haven't asked anything else the rest of the 8 weeks. And it's interesting to get those insights. I do think that when you're working at the 75 to 100 level, you could still maybe say to people, just turn to the people you're clustered with and have a little conversation for maybe 3 minutes before we come back. It might be much harder to do that when you got 200. But for again, that's 50 to 100, you could probably still do that. And I think that this notion that I really tried to implement for the first time in a new way this year of giving them practice problems, that opens up all kinds of teaching opportunities. I mean, if you gave them a practice problem and said, next class, we're going to begin with a 5-minute Q&A on this practice problem, you better do it because it's your one chance to ask about these things and get my opinion rather than the TA's opinion or an answer 24 hours later on the bulletin board. I think that would change the way the students think about it. I think that would change the way that they engage with us afterwards. So there's a variety of ideas, but you're right. There's a certain number of students beyond which you're just not going to be able to do much other than that traditional lecture format to communicate with them.
Do you think we should stop teaching the 300 and break it into groups?
That's an interesting question for the school because it would mean a different way of thinking about how we use our faculty time and faculty resources. I do think that it would be a better learning experience in some ways, but I guess the key question is, in those classes where you have 300, can you also have the TA sessions, the lab sessions, and are those consistent enough across the TAs who are running them, or whatever level of instructor is running them, to make it a similar and similarly valuable experience for everyone concerned, or is there so much variation that we worry about the different experience that different people have? I know in my own class, we've been thinking about, should we have a health economics lab? Well, the past 2 years I've had 1 or 2 of 3 TAs who could actually lead a lab, again, at different levels of experience. One maybe a 4th-year econ student, one's a 2nd-year econ student. So they have much different backgrounds and much different amounts of economics intuition. It's become part of their view of the world, as Mike described. And so it's hard to say that would be an equal experience for all concerned. Then again, if we broke it up into 3 classes, unless you had the same person teaching the 3, it wouldn't necessarily be the same experience, and none of us would want to do that necessarily. And the flip side of that is, if you allow for that seminar-like aspect, it goes off in different directions. I mean, I can give the same lecture from one year to the next, but if one class jumps on a point about in the obesity economics. The very first year I taught that lecture, somebody said, well, should we let people do stupid things? And I say, how are you going to regulate against everything stupid that somebody might do? And that was an interesting point. Well, the next year I sort of made a comment about that going in. And I thought students would still pick up on it, but everybody just sort of left it. And so you get much different discussions, and you get different discussions from one year to the next. You would certainly have different discussions from one group to the next. So it would be a different experience, but the overall quality of the experience might still be better for all concerned. Again, we'd have to think very big picture about resource use in the school.
So we have to use a mic because it's being recorded.
Okay. I have to agree with Mike's comment that I am thoroughly impressed with the fact that you decided to talk about education for your Dean's Lecture, and I would hope that would be highlighted somewhere on the school's website or somewhere so that we can really begin to elevate the discussion about education. But what I really liked about what you said, and it's something that actually just came from a discussion I had with the instructor in our evaluation course, because I'm doing, we're doing a class on data sources on Friday, and we decided rather than making it detailed that we actually wanted to actually get sort of a big picture take of the students on data sources. And I think what I appreciated most of all, and I think we need to really think about a little bit more, is getting rid of the notion that that students have to walk away from here with a lot of detail. And that in fact what we want them to understand is the big picture, and we want them to understand the process, the thinking process, the critical thinking process. And I really appreciate that that's in fact what you're doing, or we're discussing in your lecture, and I would hope there was some way that that we could get that message through to a lot of other instructors, that in fact that's sort of the mission here, is the process, the thinking, the critical thinking, and it's not the details, and we can get rid of some of those details.
It's a challenge to do that. I mean, I completely agree with you, but it is a challenge to do that, and I do appreciate the positive comments. Steve.
I'm going to say something sort of similar to what Dave said. You know, in the medical school and in medical schools across the country, a lot of students are voting with their feet, and you're lucky if 10% of the class shows up. And this is consistent around the country. What they do is they take the videotapes. What?
For the basic science.
Yeah. And what they not for the not for the physical exam. And what they do is they right. They take the video and they listen to it, or the audio, and they listen to it double speed with the PowerPoint slides. And when a lot of students ask me here to make sure, when they object to the fact that the one point that I said is not on the PowerPoint slide, or is the lecture going to be recorded, I find sometimes I bridle, but it's also a challenge for me to justify why it's important for students to be sitting in front of me when they could be just watching a video, at the time of their choosing. And I think that the new, electronic revolution is a real, I think you were getting to this, is a real challenge to all of us as to how this mode of conveying information is relevant at all. And I think that we need to be thinking, as you are, of different models for how we teach, because in fact, the chalk and talk lecture does not require the student to be sitting there, and if it's all about asking questions at the end, they can, there are all sorts of ways to do that as well. But it requires time and investment and support that neither this school nor many schools provides. I mean, the kind of investment that requires to create really creative labs or really meaningful interactions is very, very time intensive. And I think that's one of the, speaking of economics, that's one of the problems. I mean, it's much quicker to create a PowerPoint presentation than to do any of these things that fundamentally challenge this model. You just could assign them a book chapter, but then you have to do something on top of it because they will not learn it well. So I'd be interested in your general thoughts of whether the chalk talk in-person lecture is going to survive at all, and how we're going to support meaningful alternatives which do require time.
Right. Well, I think I hope it survives, because certainly from the instructor side of things, there is a difference between pre-recording a lecture or lecturing in front of a dozen people and lecturing in front of 50 to 100 people. And there is something to be said for that real-time discussion, that real-time, can I make the connections and can I ask a question of the instructor that makes sense so that I can find out, am I getting this? And maybe the 5 other people around me probably all have the same question. And so I hope it doesn't completely go away. I certainly see that since I've started recording my class, fewer students show up. I've given them incentive not to show up, I suppose. And I don't know that I want to go the other way and say, well, I'm not going to record it, and if you want to learn it, you've got to show up. That's kind of not necessarily the best approach. But I do think there is a role for it. Maybe there is a select number of classes where the concepts are complicated, or the integration of concepts is complicated, where some degree of in-person, real-time group discussion is very useful. But it certainly could be the case that the amount of teaching that goes on that's real-time live versus not might change. And we certainly talk about sort of courses that might become a hybrid method, where you pre-record some things. Maybe students listen to it on a CD or via the web or whatever, and then when they come to class, it really is all about discussion afterwards. So it's hard to say, but certainly you're also correct that to do any of this, and I mean even to come up with, for the assignments, here's the assignment I want you to do in exercises and cost effectiveness. Here's a practice workbook where I or my TA has explained every step that we took. And then here's another practice one that you're going to do as a small group so you could present it in the live talk. That's essentially 3 assignments that you have to make up. And it does require more time in order to implement that. So I don't know what the resource solution is, But I do think that we are going to have to get just more creative about keeping students' attention and just being aware of the fact that the balance of what we do in person, what we expect students to do on their own, and how much lecturing we need to do in order to convey the information is probably going to change in the next 5 to 10 years. Jim.
Yeah, I'm glad you made that point. I was going to make it, and that is I think we have some faculty now experimenting more with hybrids. And I just remember one of the workshops on teaching, faculty teaching workshops we had, the one person who came from outside the institution said, never do in class what you can have your students do outside of class. And so it may be, you know, and it's not true for all courses, and it does take resources. It's very time intensive for us to really upfront change a class. But, you know, we could have them doing more online and actually perhaps even reduce class time, but make that class time that we do have more effective, because we can enter into these kinds of, you know, more discussions with them in case presentations, and the more theoretical things and that, or you know, can be dealt with online. The real complex things, yeah, well, we do that in class. I think we're going to have to, you know, move to that. 50% of our students now take an online class. Now, sure, they're taking it for scheduling reasons or what have you, but they're doing it. And so if we can now begin, our full-time students, I'm sorry, our full-time in-residence students. And so if we can begin to you know, have some faculty who are doing it and successful and experimenting, and then begin to learn from them as to, you know, the best ways to do it, I think you know, in 5 years or so we may start to see an upsurge of that. More effective teaching and more efficient teaching for both the students and the faculty, but upfront resources, I think, are going to be important.
We have time for one more question. Alan. Thank you, Kevin. Wait for the microphone.
Sure. Well, while I'm waiting, I think if I had you in graduate school, I might have been a health economist today. This was outstanding. Thank you very much. I was thinking about your references to having fewer topics and how do you select what they are. Robert Frank and Ben Bernanke, when they rewrote macro and microeconomics text, they reduced it from encyclopedias to about a dozen or 14 core ideas that are reinforced throughout. And they said that for survey type of work, this is beyond that, but the graphs and equations and the intensive math could be later, and they focused on narrative. And as I'm listening to what you've described in Hard Cider and how you teach, in a way that's part of what pulls this together. So if we think about what's the prerequisite before you come to economics, in terms of calculus, advanced calculus, matrix algebra, some other things, maybe there's an additional learning about learning, like a metacognition that's required, and that's how do you develop a narrative? Is it reflective journalism? What is the process that brings people to see how to connect in a story these things that happen to have numbers associated with it? This was just excellent, but I wonder if you could comment briefly on that.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, if I think back to my own graduate economics training, the first year, it's generally agreed, is just applied math in most graduate economics programs. As you suggested, you're doing a variety of calculus, you're doing matrix algebra, and aside from the fact that it has to be linked to something that is economic, you know, it's optimization rules. You could do it in engineering as well as you could do it in economics. And, you know, what is it that makes it economics? Well, what makes it economics is the intuition. And, you know, one thing that I think, you know, in economics programs gets students hung up sometimes is the ability to then make that link. They can do all the math. They're great at the math. But can they make that link to the intuition and then the behavior that they're trying to explain through this optimization process that we're modeling? And, you know, I'm not sure what the best method would be. Again, this is more for the students who are taking a single health economics course, or maybe just two, and not PhD students. But, you know, we have had good success with this letter to the editor type of approach, because it makes them put it in a context. It makes them pull out the intuition, and it makes them, again, given that I give them 250 or 350 words, they don't have a lot to work with, and they really have to concentrate then on what's an efficient way to tell this story. You know, for broader learning, you know, I think that it would be something where, you know, you take a set of ideas and it's largely descriptive. You know, why is this person behaving this way? And even if you didn't have any economics at all, but tried to write a description of why someone behaved the way they did, that would be a good starting point, because then the economics that you have could formalize the thought process around the theory that comes with it in economics, the utility optimization or the profit maximization or all those sorts of things. But just to start with, here's a situation we observe. Tell me why you think the person acted this way, and then to build from that might be one way to really sort of start people off with this notion of connections rather than the connections being the last thing that they think about.
Well, I know there are other questions and people want to talk to you, and so we're going to have a reception. We have some hard cider outside. I do want to recognize your parents, Mr. and Mrs. Frick. You did a great job. So, you know, the conversation that's going on is a conversation I also think we need to have, and we've tried to start in various ways around the school, how we teach and what's the most effective, and especially how do we, you know, in an era of scarce resources, do the very best job. So we look forward to your advice and help on that.
Great.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.
Sure.